Welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hi, I'm John Schaefer, welcoming you to a virtual event from the Green Space. That's New York Public Radio's ground floor performance venue, and in normal times, we'd have a live audience with us, but as I say, this is a virtual event featuring music by the clarinetist and composer Kinan Azmeh, and done in collaboration with Carnegie Hall's Voices of Hope series, which is a remarkable set of concerts and programs devoted to artistic responses to difficult times. And resilience is very much a theme that you will hear echoing in a lot of Kinan Azmeh's music, and especially in a new piece that we'll get a chance to hear in the next hour. We'll speak with Kinan Azmeh. We'll also speak with Clive Gillinson, who is the executive and artistic director of Carnegie Hall, about the Voices of Hope series. Over 100 events in this ongoing set of performances. So we'll find out more about that, but we're going to begin with some of Kinan's own music. Now, in addition to being a clarinetist, he's a composer, an improviser. He's played with everyone from the New York Phil to the Silk Road Ensemble, led by Yo-Yo Ma. The piece that we're going to hear to start is called Jizreen, and that is the name of a small town outside of Damascus. Kinan is a longtime New York City resident, but he was born and raised in Syria, and the sounds of his native homeland are never far from his music. Let's hear Kinan Azmeh and Cityband performing Jizreen. Music by Kinan Azmeh, the clarinetist and composer, and his Cityband, recorded live recently in the green space. The piece is called Jazreen, and Kinan Azmeh joining me here in our virtual green space this evening. Kinan, that's a beautiful piece, but also a very pensive, almost melancholy one. Is that how you feel when you think of this town in Syria?
Thank you, John. Hello to everybody who's watching. Jazreen has a very special place in my heart. It's a small village that is outside of Damascus, maybe about 10 kilometers away from the city center. And it's a place where every weekend, my parents used to take me and my sister, and we'll go and meet all the extended family, and people will bring their friends. But most importantly, we used to go and work with the soil. There are trees in that village. My grandparents owned a little piece of land. So there are trees that are maybe 4 or 5 years younger than I am. And I think it's the place where I developed my most sincere and honest sense of home. I think this cliche that says where you plant a tree, that's where home is. I really feel it at most in that village. And I think the melancholia you feel or you hear in the piece is due to the fact that, yes, this is, a big part of home for me, this little village called Jazreen. But unfortunately, the village was under siege for many years, and it was heavily bombed in the past 10 years. So this piece was an homage to the soil, of course, to the apricot trees. Most of them, died or aged also. But most importantly, I think to the people of Jazreen, that many of its citizens left it.
So the performance we heard, as I mentioned, was recorded recently in the green space. And I just want to give credit to the rest of the members of Cityband, Kyle Sana on guitar, Josh Meyer on bass, and John Hadfield playing drums and percussion, and the hand drum that he plays. Is that a duff or a tar?
It depends. I mean, the name depends on which culture you're asking.
Right.
I have to ask John to see to which direction he wants to go.
So, so you were born and raised in Syria. What brought you to New York in the first place? Why did you come here?
Back in '92, I got a scholarship to study chamber music in a summer music festival called the Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music up in New Hampshire. And I was 16 at the time. And that was the first time that I was in the US. After that, a quick, time, I spent some time in New York and also some time in Boston. I fell in love with both cities, but mainly with Boston, I have to say. I went back to Damascus. I did my undergrad both in music and electrical engineering. And when I finished from both, and I started to apply for grad schools, I applied actually for both to Juilliard, but also to many schools in Boston. I did end up studying in Boston for 1 year at the Boston Conservatory, but I was still eyeing New York, I think. But also I wanted to study with Charles Niedek, my wonderful teacher at Juilliard. So then, I was in Boston. I thought maybe I should apply again. So I went to Juilliard, auditioned, got in. And then New York sucked me in like it does to many people. There's something that I want to say. It wasn't my plan to stay. It's been now 20 years that I'm in the city. But my plan was always like, I come here to do my studies and then hopefully go back to Damascus. But then one thing led to another. And then now I feel equally at home in New York. Brooklyn is my place too.
Yeah. And it's also a city that has a lot of great clarinet traditions. I mean, you mentioned Charles Niedek, who is one of many wonderful clarinetists. David Schifrin is another classical clarinetist on the New York scene, but also jazz clarinet, klezmer clarinet. I mean, that instrument, the kind of soulful sound that is distinct to the clarinet, is something we hear in a lot of different contexts in New York City. And you've played in a fair number of different contexts with that instrument.
I think this is, I think you just answered the question. This is what kept me in New York. The contrast between cities is always interesting. In Damascus growing up, there weren't many clarinetists. Maybe there were like 5 or 6 of us active in the scene. And then you move to New York and suddenly everybody is a clarinetist. Apparently everybody in high school went through a phase where they had to learn the clarinet. So that was very interesting for me. But of course, being part of this wonderful scene, hearing the clarinet in different contexts is really what attracts me to New York. But also the fact that the clarinet is an instrument that can be found in so many different genres is, I think, what attracted me to the clarinet in the first place.
So at what point did you begin improvising as a clarinetist? Is that something that you grew up with in Arab classical music?
Not really, no. I started improvising like on the later side. I always wanted to compose. There was like a little obsession I had, like I wanted to write my own music. And it's due to the fact, my parents have so much to do with this. I'm gonna make this story short. It's a good story. My dad was once on a trip to England. This is in the late 80s or mid 80s. And he got us a little computer, ZX Spectrum, it's called. It was like the 48 kilobytes, small computer. And he announced to my sister and I that we had to learn how to program. And we had no idea. I was maybe 7 years old at the time or 8 years old at the time. And what he said back then, he said, kids, in your days, you'll have to choose between being programmers or being programmed. And that idea got stuck in my head, not only in terms of coding, but in terms of creating your own content. So he encouraged, and him and my mom encouraged us to compose also at an early age. And I do think improvisation is a sort of composition, and the other way around also is accurate. So I started composing a few simple melodies, got more into improvisation. Maybe in my late teens, I joined a rock band playing saxophone. And so that was the gate through which I entered improvisation. But now I try to think of music as a continuum, whatever is composed, improvised, or just performed. I think it's all the same thing.
Well, and there are people who claim that composition and improvisation are the same act, just one is stretched out over time and the other is immediate in
That's
time.
right. That's a great way to explain it. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of your compositions. I mean, we'll get to the new piece, the work for the Voices of Hope project, in a couple of minutes. But the next piece that we're going to hear is Dance. And this is part of a larger work called The Fence, the Rooftop, and the Distant Sea. It's a very specific title. You must have a very specific place in mind.
Absolutely. This piece was commissioned by the Elbphilharmonie for clarinet and cello, actually, for myself and Yo-Yo Ma. And we did the premiere in 2017 at the new Elbphilharmonie. But then this one movement, I kept, sometimes you write something and then it comes back and haunts you, and it begs for another life. So this movement lent itself very nicely for the band. The space actually where the piece was created, the piece was written in Beirut. My wife is Lebanese, and we were spending some time in Beirut, and we rented on Airbnb an apartment that had a fence. There was a rooftop, and there was the distant sea, obviously. And it was a time, maybe it's been 5 or 6 years that I have not been back in Damascus. And Beirut, for those who don't know, Beirut is actually kind of close geographically. We're talking like few hundred kilometers away. And I was looking from this apartment, and you can see almost the Syrian coastline from where I am. So home felt very close, yet very far. Mm-hmm. And also it was a time where I started to forget a little bit of details from home. So I would do these imaginary drives between point A to point B in Damascus just to remember how the landscape looks like. And this piece, this 5 movements, we're gonna hear only Dance, which is the 4th movement, was about 2 characters trying to complete each other's memories, and only to realize that the most important memories were the simplest.
Mm. All right, so Dance is the name of the first of these 2 pieces that we're going to hear. The second one is called Daraa, that's another place name in Syria, right?
Absolutely correct. Daraa, it's the name of the tune, but also it's the name of a city in the south of Syria. And this is the city where everything started in 2011. People went to the streets in March 2011, mainly in Daraa. And the melody you're gonna hear in this piece is not original. It's a very old traditional tune. And what I tried to do with it is to give it a different context. It's a very, when we heard this tune in the beginning, it was on an optimistic note. And now 10 years later, it's a different land, there's a landslide happening right there. And this is what I tried to do with this piece, is just to put this very known melody in a different context.
All right, let's hear 2 more performances from Kinan, Azmeh, and Cityband. The first is Dance, and then this piece called Daraa. Music by Kinan Azmeh, performed by Kinan Azmeh Cityband, recorded recently live in the green space. You heard two pieces. That last work called Daraa, named after the city in Syria where the uprising against the Assad regime began 10 years ago now. And prior to that, the longer piece we heard was called Dance, which originally comes from a larger work called The Fence, the Rooftop, and the Distant Sea. And Kinan, you mentioned that it was originally written for yourself and Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. I find it hard to imagine what that original dance might have sounded like. I'm guessing nothing like what we just heard.
The basic groove is the same and the melodies are the same. There's also optional improvisation in the clarinet and cello version. I like this aspect about music making where pieces can take different lives or, a multitude of lives.
Yeah.
And certainly it's the case in this piece.
So the reason we're doing this here in our virtual green space this evening is that you, Kinan, have written a piece for Carnegie Hall's Voices of Hope series. And I'll ask you in a minute to set up that piece for us. But first, I'd like to welcome Clive Gillinson, who is the Executive and Artistic Director of Carnegie Hall. Clive, it's great to see you again.
John, wonderful to see you as well. And thank you so much for inviting me onto the show.
So tell us a little bit about Voices of Hope. It's an extraordinary collection, 100 events in a span of just 2 weeks. I know how Carnegie Hall works. This is not something you threw together in the last year, is it?
It certainly isn't. I mean, all our festivals, we tend to plan 3, 4, 5 years in advance. And this is a project I'd always wanted to do. Some of it grew out of my relationship and very close relationship with Mstislav Rostropovich. It was, I think, the closest relationship of my life, with a truly great artist, one of the most extraordinary artists of our day or any other day. And he used to tell me the stories about how Shostakovich at the time of Stalin used to sleep out on his landing with his suitcase packed so that if the secret police came for him, he wouldn't be disturbing his family, and how he'd invite Rostropovich round for a drink just to talk. And he'd come in, pour the vodkas, and they'd sit there for an hour. Shostakovich wouldn't say a word. And at the end of an hour, he said, "Thank you so much. That conversation was so important to me." Because he didn't dare to speak because everything was bugged. And, there were just so many stories he told me about that. And I think coming here to America and looking at the whole issue around the history of slavery and the music that came out of that, and the fact that, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's what's happening now in Syria, the Armenian genocide, when one thinks of so many things we're looking at, obviously the period of the Soviet Union, so many things where artists always have to create, no matter how horrific the circumstances. And the fact that they will continue to create music that's not about the misery. It's usually about hope, aspiration, dreams, allowing people or enabling people to retain their identity and their sense of being a human being when others are trying to destroy that sense altogether. And, particularly because of the background of slavery here, it added another dimension to everything that I knew about before in terms of what we would want to pay tribute to. So this festival really flowed out of that. And we planned it, as I say, probably 3 to 4 years ago. And of course, it was a real live event. And now within a very short period, we had to convert the entire thing to a virtual festival, which is our first ever virtual festival out of the 14 festivals we've done since I arrived. We began festivals then, really trying to look at some of the biggest, most important issues of the day. And sadly, most of those very, very tough issues, the really harsh things that happen, they always remain topical. It's a great shame that's the case, but it's true.
So, for example, the great German singer Uta Lemper did a program of songs written in the depth of the Holocaust, written in the camps in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The Black American experience, Samora Pinderhughes, just, I believe, yesterday, as part of the Voices of Hope Festival. So the historic, the current, and in the case of Syria, it's both this is a current crisis that we can already, look back on a decade or more of tragedy and catastrophe.
And the destruction of a nation. Absolutely, so tragic, and a country with such an extraordinary culture.
So what was Kinan's brief when you first got in touch with him to invite him to be part of the festival?
Well, basically, he's an artist we know so well, and certainly he's appeared at Carnegie Hall with the Silk Road Ensemble in other ways. And our view always, when we are talking to artists, he knew what the subject was at our festival, but I always feel it's important for an artist to explore what matters to them. We don't try and define what it is we're asking them to write. And it's the same with programming. It's the same with everything. You invite a great artist to perform because it's their voice you want your audience to engage with. And so, with Kinan, this was very much about what he felt it was important for him to say at this time.
So it's a 2-week festival, as you say, your first online festival, perforce. We're coming towards the end of it. I understand you've invited Leonard Bernstein to wrap up the proceedings tomorrow. How does that happen?
Well, obviously Lenny was, somebody who, really cared enormously about the sort of society you live in. He was very, very conscious of his Jewish roots and his Jewish heritage, and therefore the Holocaust. So, we felt this was something, his voice. Look, his voice comes into so many of the things we do. So, he really was one of the true giants of American culture and American music. But we're exploring dance, theater, literature, films. So, this festival, as with all our other festivals, is really about trying to explore right across the span of the cultural world and trying to find interfaces between all of those things. So audiences are taken on journeys really across the spectrum of the arts. And so many people tend to love one area of the arts. And the fascinating thing about these festivals is they almost always encourage people to travel way beyond the things that they know.
Well, and it's also, if there is a silver lining, and I think most clouds do have one, with the pandemic and things going online, one of the benefits is that people who miss these events can see them later because they remain online and people can stream them. So what will this Bernstein finale tomorrow look like?
Well, it's with Lenny, it's just very much about Lenny's sort of conscience of the world. So and I think more important really is just thinking about what the whole festival is trying to communicate, because that really is what we're interested in. There's so many different artists, and and 99% of them are living.
So, that's an important distinction to make.
It is an important distinction to make. And so, frankly, this is really about the voices of people like Kinan, so many of the artists of our day who really have lived through so many of the experiences. One of the things to say about Lenny is that he didn't suffer. One of the things Lenny always said was, he felt he never was able to plumb the depths in the same way as people who had actually lived through these horrific circumstances, because he had not. And he was very aware of that. And that's why, he always wanted to work with people and try and find their voices around issues like this, because it was not part of his life.
Well, I'm glad, Clive, that you used the word voices a couple of times in that answer there, because Kinan, that gets us into some of the texture of the piece that Carnegie Hall has commissioned for the Voices of Hope Festival, which is the work we're going to hear next, called On Resilience. Tell us about the sound of this piece. It's not just instruments, right?
Absolutely. I just want to actually to follow something that Clive mentioned, in relation to Bernstein. also I haven't suffered during the Syrian crisis, and I think it's something that I always have in the back of my mind, is how to relate and how to understand people who really go through things that are beyond what we can express in real life. I think that's why we use the arts, to try to connect, to sympathize, and to understand the sufferings of people. And for this piece, for our resilience, I've been collaborating with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and they have collected about hundreds of audio testimonies using WhatsApp of people who are living inside of Syria. These sound bites are really, really very short. Some of them 2 minutes long. Some of them are only like 5 or 6 seconds long. Across different geographical part of the country, across ages and gender. And it was really moving for me just reading all these voices. And the piece that I ended up coming up with ended up being a very simple piece, and its sole purpose is to accompany and to amplify voices that have been sidelined or unheard in the past 10 years. I've always felt that if people really want to know what's going on in Syria, for example, I always say that you need to hear and listen to the stories of 24 million Syrians telling their stories. Only then can you get close to understanding what's going on. And I think that applies to any tragedy. And most importantly, we have to pay attention to people who are surviving this and they're still able to keep their sanity. And these voices are incredibly moving. Of course, what you're going to hear are voices in Arabic. But there are two, like the bookend for me, I would like to translate briefly. The first gentleman who comes on, that we can hear, says, and he summarizes everything by saying, the question is, what are your hopes, for the future? And his answer was, I wish somebody asked me this more than 10 years ago. And the final comment you hear, I left all the testimonies from kids to the end of the piece. And they're unbelievable. There are kids who are 10 years old, people who just lived, changing camps every year or two. The last one is by a child who's maybe 5 or 6 years old, who simply says, I would like to go back to my village and rebuild it. And for me, it summarizes, I think, and this is for me the best connection I could think of, at least in this concert, to the Voices of Hope festival. And this is, I think, the essence of resilience. People who are going through really terrible times are still thinking, what's next? How can we build a decent life for ourselves and for others around us?
Well, let's hear the piece. Kinan Azmeh wrote it. Carnegie Hall commissioned it for their Voices of Hope festival. The Kinan Azmeh Cityband recorded live in the green space with On Resilience.
بعد 10 سنين من الحرب شو بتمنى كان حدا يسألنا هالسؤال من زمان قبل 10 سنين. بتمنى لو ما مات أخوك وأخوي لا يعيشوا غيرهم. بتمنى الحرب لو ما كانت. خلال ال10 سنين الإنجاز اللي أنا فخور فيه ما في ولا أي إنجاز. بالعكس، الإنجازات اللي كنا منجزينها ضيعناها. ووقت اللي بلشت الحرب من 10 سنين شو كانت توقعاتنا إنه المشوار طويل. دخلنا في نفق مظلم آخرته في ضوء، بس مسافة لنطلع من هالنفق ما حدا بيعرفها غير رب العالمين. أصعب لحظة مريت فيها بهال10 سنين، اللحظة اللي شفت فيها الناس عم بتموت والعالم عم بتتاجر بدم الأطفال. أصعب لحظة صارت في حياتنا وقت اللي اعتزنا ما شفنا حدا جنبنا.
أكبر أمنية إنه ما بقى ندوق المرار اللي عشنا فيه خلال هاي 10 سنوات من فقد وعذاب وخذلان. أصعب لحظة مريت فيها كانت اعتقال زوجي، ثم وصول خبر وفاته. قبل ما تبدأ الحرب كان في توقعات أو أمنيات أحلام المستقبل كنا عايشينه وعم نستسلم كوصول للشهادة الجامعية لعائلة مستقرة سعيدة. شيء فخورة بإنجازه خلال هاي 10 سنوات فضل رب العالمين، القدرة اللي يبقى مستمرة، يعني يبقى واقفة على رجلي، القدرة إني أعين أطفالي ما أحتاج أي إنسان. بعد 10 سنين من الحرب والدمار والسير للتهجير، صرنا نتمنى أن توقف الحرب ونرجع لبيوتنا ولو الدمار ولو راح كل شيء، نرجع نعرف إنه هذا كان بيتنا وكنا عايشين فيه وحلوة، ونعرف أولادنا إنه هاي بلدنا وهاي أرضنا وهذا بيتنا وهذول جيراننا، ونتمنى فعلا نرجع لبيوتنا. أول شيء فخورة فيه من خلال هال10 سنوات، فخورين إنه مهما بعدنا عن بيوتنا ضلينا محافظين على ما نحن، على كرامتنا، على حبنا للناس، على عمل الخير. يعني فخورة إني صح تركت ناس، تعرفت على غير ناس، حبيتهم أكثر، وكل ما تنقلنا من بلد لبلد صرنا نتعرف على ناس ونحبهم ونعزهم، وهذا شيء كتير أنا فخورة فيه. الله بيبعث لنا ناس كتير طيبين. أما توقعاتي ما بعرف، كنا بنتوقع إنه الحرب فترة صغيرة وتنتهي، بس ما صار اللي كنا متوقعينه واللي كنا بدنا إياه، لأنه ما حدا وقف معنا، تركونا نحن لحالنا نعاني ونحارب ونتعذب، ما حدا وقف معنا طبعا، كل الدول تخلت عنا، بس الحمد لله إرادتنا قوية ورب العالمين معنا. وبالنسبة للحظات الصعبة في كتير لحظات صعبة مرينا فيها، يعني لما نكون عم نتهجر من بيوتنا ونترك كل شيء مثلا تعبنا وبنينا نتركه ورانا ونهرب، هاي كتير صعبة. والأصعب من هيك لما نقدم الشباب والورد نقدمهم تضحية لهالبلد، يعني كانت كتير كمان صعبة، لأن نفقد الناس اللي بنحبهم، الشباب اللي قدمناهم شهداء، الناس اللي كنا بنحبهم ونعزهم كتير، غاليين على قلوبنا، هيك في لحظة بيروحوا بيفقدنا، هي كمان لحظات كتير صعبة. الحمد لله.
بتمنى أنه يصير عندنا بيت وسطوح ونلعب فيه. أنا محمد عمري 8 سنين، بدي خلص الحرب وصير دكتور أعالج الناس. أنا ولدت بالمخيم بالحرب. قبل 10 سنين ما كنت كان عمري بضع شهور قليلة، ما كنت بعرف حدا من هنيك، ومضيت عمري كله نزوح، وكل سنة أقضيها بمدرسة شكل، وتعرفت على رفقات كتيرة، وكمان نزحت من عندهم. ولهلا ما بعرف إنه هيك تمنيات الأطفال كيف نتمنى نرجع لبلادنا ونعيش حياة أحلى من هيك. نتمنى نروح على ضيعتنا وما يطبع علينا حرب ونرجع نعمر بيوتنا.
The world premiere performance of On Resilience. Kinan Azmeh Cityband recorded live in the green space with Kinan, of course, on clarinet, Kyle Sana guitar, Josh Meyer on bass, John Hadfield drums, the voices of 10 years of tragedy and warfare in Syria, forming the basis of that work, which was commissioned by Carnegie Hall for their Voices of Hope Festival, which has been going on for the past 2 weeks and concludes tomorrow. And we've been speaking both with Kinan Azmeh and with Clive Gillinson of Carnegie Hall. Clive, you were talking about Mstislav Rostropovich as kind of a long ago progenitor, a muse for this festival. One of the things about Rostropovich was he never learned to speak English properly, really. And yet he was such an amazing communicator, an amazing storyteller, that you always understood what he was trying to convey to you. What is the story that you're telling? What is the meaning that you're trying to convey through this festival?
Well, firstly, I agree with you. Slava Rostropovich was astonishing in that way. He was more expressive in a language he couldn't speak well than most people who were natives in that language. But it was similar with his conducting. He was not a really good conductor. His technique was not good, but he gave some of the greatest performances of any conductor I've ever known, because of this ability to communicate and connect with people and with the music in a unique way. But I think in the end, what we're trying to say through this festival, and it is a little bit what Lenny Bernstein is saying, tomorrow with the performances of Beethoven 9 that he did with the fall of the Berlin Wall, on both sides of the wall, is that the arts really speak to us as human beings. It doesn't matter the horrific sides to human beings and to human nature and to the things people will do to each other, but somehow or other, the arts will always find a way to give us hope, to give us aspiration, to ensure that we can still believe in the most important human values. And the arts will always shine through in that way and shine a light of sort of beauty and inspiration onto life, no matter what is happening. And I think that is the pure magic of the arts. And it's why this festival is so important to us.
And Kinan, resilience certainly is a key part of art's ability to not only survive dark times, but to illuminate them. Now, you've been here in New York through the past 10 years of the civil war in Syria. What about your family? What's their status right now?
The extended family has been all over the place. Like many Syrians, many people, found shelter elsewhere in the country, but also in other parts of the world. My parents have been splitting time between Damascus and New York. They come and spend some time with me in New York, but also at my sister's place in Cleveland. So they're okay. They're okay. Yeah, but the extended family, now we have the cousins, like the cousins that I play with in Jisreen. Some of them are in England now, some are in Spain, some are in Germany, all over the place.
So can you go back if you had a mind to? Could you go back to your home neighborhood?
In the last few years, I have been going back to see my parents. The last time I was back maybe is about a year ago. I went for like maybe 3 or 4 days. But now my trips are very different. Now I go and I just go and see my parents. And most of the time, actually, I don't leave my apartment. I just stay with them because that's the purpose why I go. Hopefully, I'll be able to come back, to go back to contribute musically. I want to, contribute rebuilding the same way that little boy was saying at the end of the audio clip.
Is there music happening? I mean, I know you just said you don't get out of your apartment, but do you get a sense that the arts have not been totally stamped out by 10 years of devastation?
Actually, if you look at what Syria has produced artistically in the past 10 years, it's really incredible. I think, artists realize that art making is no longer a luxury. It's actually based on urgency. And so there are so many new genres of music that are created in the past 10 years. I'm not saying they were not before, but I think they came under the spotlight more. And suddenly also Syrians realized that they can talk about things that for many years they could not talk about. So there's like a certain openness in terms of what artists can approach. And also the fact that people, I think, moved. It pushed people to be by far more productive than before. There are artists still playing in Damascus and in other cities, of course. There are public performances still going on. And I really salute people who are managing during all of this to simply focus on like holding an instrument and play. It looks and feels almost irrelevant to worry about, perfecting a C major scale when there's like bombs falling on your roof. So I hope that the art survives, but most importantly, I hope that the human spirit survives. Speaking of optimism, I think artists have the ability to be optimistic in times where other people are not. And it's a responsibility. And I think optimism is contagious. Yeah. If you're holding on to that, you can spread it around.
Clive, I'll give you a last chance to spread a little optimism. What are the plans for any kind of reopening of Carnegie Hall?
Well, we're planning to open in October. We'll be announcing on June the 8th. We would normally have announced in January, but where we always have planned 3 to 5 years in advance, 3 to 5 weeks seems optimistic now, with the way the world keeps changing. But we felt we had to leave the announcement as late as possible so that we have the maximum knowledge before we go into it. But we're looking at doing less concerts than normal through the fall. And also there'll mostly be recitals and chamber music, just to give us greater flexibility if things need to move at all. So we've moved all the larger ensembles into the new year when we hope everything will be much, much more secure. So, I mean, we're absolutely committed. Live music is so important. I think everybody feels it is part of what makes New York, New York. Without culture, no great city is a great city. And so we have a responsibility above anything, to actually give people that hope, aspiration, and the beauty of great art, because that needs to be part of life. So we'll be there.
Glad to hear it. The Voices of Hope Festival, in the meanwhile, has been 2 weeks of extraordinary music making. And we'll leave you with a final piece by Kinan, Azmeh, and Cityband called Wedding. Kinan, care to tell us what Wedding refers to?
Absolutely. This is a piece that has been a classic, like ending of show for the band and I. It's an earlier piece. The piece was written in 2007, and it refers to the mood that one can find in a Syrian traditional wedding. To be more specific, the wedding that will happen in in the public square in the village. I always like to joke that it's the kind of wedding where even if you don't like your neighbor, you have to invite them to it. Everybody shows up. And usually in these weddings, the musicians show up and there's no playlist of sort. They play whatever they like to play. And their playlist changes according to their mood and maybe how many drinks they have too. So the piece tries to depict that very unpredictable situation in a wedding party. But it's one of these pieces that changed meaning over the years. I found it incredibly inspiring that in the past 10 years, there are so many people back home who continued to manage to fall in love in the past 10 years. And I found this an incredible act of resilience, that in spite of bullets, barrel bombs, even chemical attacks, people have the strength and the courage to fall in love. Of course, whether people get married or not, it's none of our business. But for me, I cannot but to see this as an incredible act of resilience. And it might be a good reminder for all of us that falling in love is one of the very few human rights that no authority can take away. So this is wedding.
There is a British punk band called Idols whose record that they put out 2 years ago is called Joy as an Act of Resistance. And, you know, that idea that love and joy and just a refusal to be crushed, that is part of what makes us human. It is certainly part of what makes the arts so important to us. Clive Gillinson, Kinan, Azmeh, thank you both for being with us in our virtual green space this evening for this Voices of Hope event. Thank you so much.
John,
Thank you, John.
very
Thank
much
you.
indeed.
And also my thanks to our crew at the Green Space and at WQXR, and of course the team at Carnegie Hall as well. Here to conclude is Kinan Azmeh Cityband with Wedding.
Thank you.